introduction and a very warm welcome from me too to this webinar. I am Melanie Schröter and I teach in the university's Department of Languages and Cultures. And today I will talk about how and why European languages borrow from each other. And with that, I will go into the talk. And Pete already mentioned that you could share, that you could ask questions using the chat. But maybe if you want to, I could also ask a couple of questions, very simple ones at the beginning, you know, just to warm you up or get you involved. And we can see whether you want to write some suggestions in the chat as well. So first of all, right. Okay, so first of all, I would like to look at together with you at what languages borrow. Is it always so straightforward as to just take one word from another language, or is there perhaps more to borrowing one language, borrowing words from another language? And then I want to look at why do languages actually do that? Because surely every language can create its own new words. So why go and take it from others? So we'll have a look at that. And then also, where do languages go to borrow? Actually, can we just, you know, does any language borrow from any other language, or is there perhaps a little bit more to it? And then we're going to look at whether languages, whether words really behave in other languages as they would at home. Yeah, and then I'm going to come to some conclusions and leave you with perhaps hopefully also motivating messages as to why it's interesting to study these things. Okay, so at first, let's just look at, because I titled this talk Traveling Words, right? So let's look at words and words that get borrowed from one language into another language. Words. And the concise Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics explains a loan word as follows, as you can read on the slide. A loan word is a word imported by borrowing from another language. So they give the example of English chamber is one of the many loan words introduced from Old French in the Middle Ages, from Old French into English. Karma is a borrowing from Sanskrit in the 19th century, and Blitz is one from German in the 1940s. So far, so good. Seems simple. We
Melanie,
could... Yeah.
Can I just pause you there for a second? We're just losing your signal slightly.
Right.
Would you mind just turning your camera off for me, just to see if we can improve the signal slightly?
Okay. That's fine. Absolutely. Yes. So I will. It will just be my voice and the slides, and that's also good.
Yeah, it's just because
Okay.
I think there's a slight signal issue. There we go. Would you mind trying again for me?
Okay. So where should I restart from?
Absolutely perfect. If you want to restart on this slide, then we should be able to hear you a little bit better.
Okay. Fine. Okay. So the concise Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics describes a loan word, which is the result of borrowing a word from another language, as follows. It says a loan word is a word imported by borrowing from another language. So, for example, English chamber is the loan words introduced into English from Old French in the Middle Ages. Karma has been borrowed from Sanskrit in the 19th century and Blitz from German in the 1940s. So these are the examples that the Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics gives for loan words. And that seems fairly straightforward, right? So for the rest of the talk, I could maybe just look at lists of words from other languages with you. Maybe we could do that for starters to warm up, but I'm actually here to tell you there's loads more to it. So let me progress to the next slide. Yes, with which I'm actually asking you whether you know any loan words in English that come from any of the languages I'm listing here. So can you think of a loan word from German that you've heard about that we use in English, or a loan word from French or from Spanish or from Italian? So I don't know, Pete, whether you want to come up with a few ideas here, or whether we're getting some replies in the chat.
So for me, recently, me and my partner had a discussion because we were wondering what the English word for fiance was. And we actually found out that the English word for fiance is fiance. So that was quite an interesting discussion that we had. If anybody does have any others, you can drop it in the question and I'll be able to tell Melanie that one.
Yeah. So that's from French, fiancé. Yeah. We can also think of, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm trying to think of one from German, but I can't. My partner lived in the Netherlands for quite a while, and quite a lot of their words are borrowed from English or with what they add on, which is quite nice.
Yeah, yeah. There is lots of crisscrossing, well, especially from English. But even if you think about the food we eat, should immediately bring up some Italian loanwords.
Like pizza?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Okay. So, well, if you want me to, I can also give you some examples, because obviously I've brought some. So I don't know whether you've heard all of these words, but you may have heard the word Angst, or Verboten, or Schadenfreude. These are loans from German that are being used in English. Schadenfreude is not my favorite word or idea in the world. It is when you're happy about somebody else's misfortune. So really not a very reputable loan, I think. Okay, but then from French, we have castle, entrepreneur, petit as well is from French petit. And then from Spanish, think food terms, right? So we have guacamole, embargo is from Spanish as well, and guitar. Very common word in English, right? And from Italian, we have words like diva, spaghetti, another food term, and soprano, a musical term. Okay, so now, but it's really not only about English borrowing from these languages. It's very much crisscrossing all over. And this is what these examples are supposed to show you. So French borrows also from German, from English, from Italian, from Spanish, as you can see with the examples. So from German, they've got Rucksack, for example. From English, they've got Le Weekend, obviously, very important. Then from Italian, they have, for example, credit. And from Spanish, cacao. No? And in Italian, they also borrow. They borrow from French, for example, sofa. From Spanish, cigaretta. From German, birra. And from English as well. For example, boom. In Spanish, borrows from English, obviously, like we all do, and borrows from German, and borrows from Italian. They say ciao, like the Italians do, ciao. And in German, we have also borrowed from French, from Italian, for example, conto, which is a bank account, that's borrowed from Italian, and we borrow loads and loads and loads from English. And I've just thrown Portuguese here in here for added fun. So palavra is from Portuguese, and you actually use that in English as well, I believe. So I have marked some words here with an asterisk, and they already show us that it's actually not that straightforward with this, just taking a word from one language and dropping it into another language. Because, for example, the Spanish, smoking, does not refer to smoking a cigaretta. No, it's basically the word they use for tuxedo. Weird, isn't it? The Germans do the same. When we say I'm smoking, der smoking, then we are thinking about a tuxedo, and we've made it a noun. It's not a verb anymore. So then also I've marked pistola, that Spanish borrowed from German, pistol, apparently of German origin, but not quite, because German itself took it from the Czech. So it's based on Czech language, actually. So that also shows us that languages might borrow a word from a language where the word didn't even originate, where it has taken before from yet another language. The same is true for balkon, which is how we Germans pronounce balkon, which we have borrowed from French. But before us, the French have borrowed it from Italian. So it's more of a zigzag, right, than taking it from one place, dropping it into another place. And then also there is something a bit weird with the notion of one language borrowing a word from another language. So the examples that the Oxford Concise Dictionary gave, English chamber, karma, blitz, all of these words have been taken like, well, at least 80 years ago, or 100 or 200, or hundreds of years ago. So, these loans seem rather open-ended, right? Normally, when we borrow a thing, first of all, we ask for permission, and languages tend to not do that. And also, when we borrow a thing, we return it to the owner, ideally unaltered, right? So we don't mess with it before we give it back. Well, languages don't quite behave as well as we would, because also they go and change the things that they've borrowed. So we can see that with the example that the Oxford Concise Dictionary gave for a loan from French. Well, loan in inverted commas, as we now know, because in French, a chambre is still just a room. In English, a chamber is something a lot more specific that goes back to the notion of an assembly room. And now a chamber, like the Chamber of Commerce, for example, refers to mostly something in an institutional context. So it has a lot more narrow meaning. And also, that could have developed, during a long time, because the French loan word has been around in English, as we have learned, from the Middle Ages onwards. So it's okay, maybe, if things develop over such a long time. Yeah, but languages are even worse in terms of their behavior. They sometimes take an item and alter and adapt it already at the point of borrowing. So not only as part of a long-term development, but straight away. So, for example, the example blitz that we found in the Oxford Concise Dictionary explanation, this has been changed at the point of borrowing already. So English blitz always only ever meant rapid and intense air raid or bombing campaign. Whereas in German, Blitz continues to just mean lightning. So it's a weather phenomenon, no more, no less. So we can see that the meanings are perhaps somewhat related because both things come from the sky, both things make sudden light, both things can have an impact when they hit the earth, and also a destructive impact. So it's a bit related, but it's a really different meaning. These words are used in very different contexts. So these languages, they are not behaving very well, are they? So now also alone can mean loads more than just taking a word and dropping it in another place. So we have already learned they can zigzag and crisscross. They can be altered. But also, it's not just words that we take. We can also take an idea and then translate it. But we got the idea from another language. I'll show you in a bit what that looks like. So we would call that loan translation. And then we can also experience something like loan shift. So that's a change of meaning under the influence from another language, or a loan concept, sometimes called semantic loan as well, where a concept is introduced into another language by borrowing. I would say that Schadenfreude is an example of that. No? So maybe before that, there wasn't like quite such a succinct idea about this feeling of pleasure that some people get at other people's misfortune. But then you encountered the word and you thought, actually, that is a thing that I'm familiar with. So I'm just borrowing the two things. We didn't already have a word for this. No? Okay, but I'll show you more about that as well as we follow on from this slide. And the last different way to borrow from a language is a loan blend, where we create new words using partly own material and partly material borrowed from another language. So let's look at each of these phenomena in turn, because that's still relating to our question of what does get borrowed, which is a question that requires in this talk the longest answer of all the questions that I've laid out initially. So a loan translation then is a word or an expression that has been formed by translation of a corresponding word or expression in another language. An example for that is French gratte-ciel, so which means scratching the sky, which is a loan translation of English skyscraper. In German, we have a similar part loan translation where we make that cloud scratcher. So it's called a Wolkenkratzer in German. English has borrowed, has loan translated Biergarten from German Biergarten and Death Wish as well. And then Italian, piattaforma is just a loan translation of the English, you guessed it, platform. Okay, and then I mentioned loan blends or half loans, where we use material from both the own language and from the other language to create a new word. And, you know, in German, the German language is quite fond of creating new words by combining existing words. And it does that with loads of English elements as well these days. So we have something like a Chatraum in German, which is just a chat room. We have a Loopschal, which is the item depicted here. So it's one of those scarves that you can literally strangle yourselves with. And then we have cafe pads, so coffee pads for these fancy new coffee machines, and also Bestell button, which is basically the Order Now button that you can click with the mouse. So you see how here the native elements, as it were, and the borrowed elements are mixed in these creations. Then also we can have semantic shift of existing words due to borrowing meaning. So this is called, this is what I've introduced as a loan shift. So again, I've got the examples from German, but that is because those changes are subtle, and I know German the best of the languages that we use here in this talk. And so it is easier for me to observe these things. So the German verb realisieren, basically very close to English, realize, isn't it? Now gets influenced by the English meaning. Originally in German, it meant just to put something into practice or to make something become a reality. And under the influence of English, it now increasingly means understanding something, you know, by way of like a cognitive process. And also the verb texten pre-existed messenger services and so on. And originally it meant to write copy, now, especially for marketing purposes. And under the influence of English now, where to text is to use a messenger services, a service to communicate via a device, that now becomes the dominant meaning in German as well. Okay, so this is what we call a loan shift, a change of meaning under the influence of another language. And then there is also this notion that you can actually import an idea or a concept together with a linguistic item. So the example that I've got here is to like. So the verb got borrowed by French and by German, but only with the meaning, not of liking someone or something, but the act of showing approval by clicking a thumbs up or heart button on social media or messenger services. No? So we see that here in French, where a person says, don't hesitate to like or comment to get more recommendations from me. So liker is the verb used here in French. And also in the next example, it's to comment, to like, and to partager, to share. No? Whereas in German, we see that as well, that the verb gets integrated, and it gets also integrated, if you look at the second example, geliked, it gets integrated into the grammatical setup of German, because this is how we build the past participle form. Okay, Spanish and Italian actually borrowed this idea of liking something on Facebook and so on. They borrowed that as well, but they don't use it as a verb. So they tend to mostly use it to receive likes or to give something a like. So it's mostly used as a noun in those two languages. But we can see the concept really spreads across different languages from English here. But only a part of the meaning of like is borrowed into other languages. Only this specific concept, not the whole broader meaning of like. Okay, now here is an interesting one. What languages also do, they tend to sort of take something and run with it. So the idea that you could say things like this in English in these examples. So in Italian, they completely make up a false loan word, which is the terrible notion of body rental. But what it actually means is somebody is basically hiring labor via a temp agency. In French, they talk about le king, no? So it's the makeover. So they don't say makeover like we would in English. They make up a word that looks English, but is actually not used in English like this. Similarly, in German, a projector is called a beamer. Weird, because the English don't use it like that, but it seems to be an English word. Same with handy as well. In German, this is what we call a mobile phone. It's called a handy. Weird, isn't it? Handy is even an English word, but a different one. It's an adjective, and it means something different. So, sometimes languages just take something and run with it. They think, well, this is what it could sound in English, so let's try it. Yeah. So now my second question, and all of these next questions are going to be a lot quicker to deal with than my first one. Why do languages borrow? Well, yeah, like I mentioned already, we can have pervasive concepts in other languages. So we could, this Schadenfreude I gave you as an example, so the delight at somebody else's misery. Then je ne sais quoi has been borrowed from French for some time, which is now, I think, being replaced by X Factor. Diva and embargo, they all seem to be ideas that we find really useful, so we take the word and the idea from another language. Then obviously when new things come along, and especially if there are phenomena that become more prominent, we want to talk about them, and they have already pervasively been named in other languages, then we sometimes borrow them, like guacamole or graffiti, from Italian. Then there is innovation going on. So there could be innovation in finance or trade. And often the languages or the cultures that are leading these innovations are the languages that other languages borrow from. So there is a lot of financial terms, by the way, that languages have borrowed from Italian in sort of like the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. Information technology is a big one these days, and obviously that there's loads of borrowing from English going on there. Science and research obviously also prompt borrowing from languages that are leading in certain fields. And then we can also have like prestige cultures or expert cultures, where we then have cultural contact and we think that they are leading the way. So for example, fashion, like the languages associated with fashion are mostly French and Italian, and this is also something that we culturally associate with the countries in which the languages are spoken. We have a lot of food terms also from French and Italian, funnily enough, and then music terms as well. We've got loads of classical music terms that are based on Italian, but for the 20th century, where the music coming from Anglophone countries, so from the English-speaking world, has been a lot more influential in terms of popular music, we get a lot of music genres that have English names. And these genre terms then get borrowed into other languages. Okay, so much for why languages borrow. Now, where do languages actually go to borrow? Well, this is often determined by language contact. So it is mostly the languages that we borrow from that we actually also have some exposure to. Or does anyone know a loanword from the Polynesian Islands? Because that seems remote from a European perspective, for example. I tell you what, though, there is one that we use quite often. It's taboo. Yes, that is a word that originates from the Polynesian Islands. Often it's lingua francas that leave, so languages that are used by many speakers around the world as a second language that leave a big trace in other languages. So Latin has done that in the Middle Ages, and English is doing that right now. Yeah, well, it seems as though African languages have not, do not count many lingua francas amongst them. And so we don't get many loanwords from African languages. By the way, couscous is one. Okay, so then language compatibility. So obviously, if there are languages with sounds that we find very hard to create or that are very unfamiliar, then we tend to avoid those languages. And that explains perhaps part of the avoidance of African languages. And then so it means that the easier to integrate, the more likely the word catches on. But sometimes, surprisingly, well, let's say difficult words get borrowed. So it really also depends on the general interest in the word or the language. And then innovation, obviously, like I said before, when we have a lot of innovation that is based in countries where a certain language is spoken, then often the words for these new things spread with or the language spreads with the words of these new things. Okay. So now, an interesting question perhaps is whether also when we borrow from other languages, whether there is a little bit of stereotyping going on there. So we view other cultures in a certain way. We think that certain things are typical for other cultures. And so maybe when we use the word that is taken from the languages that they speak in this culture, maybe we want to also give a flavor of that culture or evoke certain things that we think are typical for this culture. So maybe that's the reason why we like to borrow things like savoir vivre or connaisseur from French, because we think, well, the French know how to enjoy life. Or that we think that things like the fights with bulls are typical for the Spanish-speaking world, and so we think we borrow words like torero or salsa, which we think typically culturally typical, or pasta for Italian, and Madonna, or for German, like verboten, can't go here. The Germans, the strict ones, no? And or also Weltschmerz, the Germans, the deep ones, the always serious ones. Maybe that's why we opt for those kinds of words to take from those cultures and their languages. Perhaps there is also a small pattern of loanwords being used to denote things or phenomena to which we have a slightly dismissive attitude. So, for example, palavra that I mentioned earlier, that is borrowed from Portuguese, is also a word that denotes the kind of talk that we're a bit dismissive of. There's just too much of a fuss going on with palavra. But also we have words like bric-a-brac, taken from French, I think, for, or ersatz is kind of not the real thing. That's taken from German. Hoi polloi, which is taken from Greek, or kitschy, which again is taken from German. So you find all of these words in English, and they mean things that we can't take quite seriously. Okay, so I leave that with you to mull over. I don't have a particular theory about this, but I think maybe if we looked deep enough, maybe we can find a little bit of a pattern like this. Okay, now the last point I really want to make is how words can have different lives when they go and travel into another language. So we have already seen that borrowing isn't quite entirely straightforward, and more odd cases include like differences in frequency. So sometimes when a word is used in another language, like a lot more often or a lot less often. Then differences in word class, so words changing word class. We have seen some examples already, like handy is an adjective in English and it's a noun in German, denoting mobile phone. And then also differences in word formation. And I'm going to just whiz through these, telling you that when it comes to differences in frequency, what we can observe when we look at large corpora of languages, so large collections of digital text that we can investigate systematically, I can find out things such as the word Wanderlust, which was actually borrowed from English, from German into English, occurs twice as often in English. So the interest in this word or the usage of this word is a lot higher in the borrowing language than in the original language. The Germans don't seem to care as much about Wanderlust as the English do. Handy obviously occurs more than 3 times as often in German than in English, because in English it's just an adjective that means something like practical, whereas in German we call it mobile phone, and these things play a big role in our everyday life. Then also there are differences in word class. I've mentioned them, handy, but also playoff is in English mostly a verb, but in Spanish it's exclusively a noun. Ersatz is an adjective in English, but in German, where it has been borrowed from, it is actually a noun. So, like I said, other languages just take a word and run with it. They do with it what they want. Yeah. And similarly, when it comes to word formation, so I'm just gonna try to explain that really briefly, but you may have heard words recently like übergeek or übercool or überpopular, übertalented. And this prefix über has been borrowed from German by English. But in German, actually, when we would use words like übertalented, überpopular, we don't use über for that. We would use super or mega together with these adjectives. So in German, the prefix über can relate to space, over, above, or across, and it can also relate to quantity and excess. English only relates to the latter. So English actually only takes a small slice of the meaning of über. And in German, we don't create a lot of new words with über. So all the words that we have with the prefix über have been around for a long time, and there isn't a lot being added to this catalog, as it were. Whereas in English is going crazy at the moment with the prefix über. We have things like Überblogger, Überboss, Überbabe, Überbroke, Überbrisk, Überboring, and so on. So it shows that the prefix is used with a lot of variety and flexibility. And again, German doesn't do that. It's fixed. So über in German also mostly combines with verbs. But in English, it doesn't combine with verbs at all. It just combines with nouns and adjectives, such as überbroke, an adjective, or überboss, a noun. Weird. So, but this is what languages do. So, to summarize that, words are the most dynamic and adaptable parts of languages. So there is a lot of zigzagging of words across languages. And also when languages innovate, they mostly do that at the lexical level. So borrowing also allows and accounts for lexical innovation, although different languages rely on borrowing more or less than others. So at the moment, English borrows way less from other languages than other languages borrow from English. Borrowing is mostly influenced by factors outside of the languages involved. So a lot of it is about innovation, is about prestige, is about, well, perhaps power as well. And then borrowing takes different shapes and forms. So it is not as straightforward as in one language borrowing an item as it is. First of all, a language might keep the item forever. A language might take an item and really run with it. A language can even make it up, as we have seen in the case of, well, body rental. And then also loan words may be used a lot less or a lot more often in the other languages, with different meanings in different contexts, and even as part of a different word class. So really changing the grammar of the word. Okay, and what this all means is, like, by way of a 10-point conclusion for you to take away from this. First of all, languages are not sealed off, self-sustaining units. Languages are really alive and they are ever changing. Languages adapt to the needs of their speakers. And languages may do this adaptation by appropriating items from abroad. I think appropriating is probably what we're looking at here, and not borrowing. Okay, studying in languages and observing languages therefore never gets boring. And learning a language and keeping up with your own language, as it were, is an open-ended process. So when you have at least 2 languages, it allows you to compare and to observe such cross-linguistic influences. And such observations challenge taking means of representation for granted. It shows you that certain languages just want to do certain things, and they do this by whatever means conveniently available. And then realizing this increases your linguistic and your cultural awareness and your adaptability as well. You can change perspective. And it also increases your analytical skills